It was a sweltering afternoon in the middle of nowhere, somewhere along Route 66. Sarah "Hawk" Johnson, a Navy SEAL with years of training and combat under her belt, rolled up to a small gas station. She had just finished a covert mission in the desert and was on her way back to base, tired but alert. As she stepped out of her black SUV, her eyes scanned the area, instinctively assessing the surroundings. The place was deserted, save for a group of motorcycles parked nearby. The bikers leaned against their bikes, laughing, their leather jackets stained by dust and sweat. They looked like trouble. Sarah didn't care. She wasn't afraid of trouble. She was a Navy SEAL. As she approached the pump, one of the bikers, a tall man with a patch that read Viper on the back of his jacket, eyed her from head to toe. His lips curled into a smirk. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for his friends to hear. "Look what we got here. A lady in military gear. Is that a real SEAL, or are you just playing dress-up, sweetheart?" His words were meant to mock, and the laughter from the other bikers followed suit. Sarah felt a flicker of irritation. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She kept her composure, choosing to ignore them as she filled her tank. But then, one of the other bikers, Mark, a stocky man with a mohawk, stepped closer. "You really think you're tough enough to be a SEAL? You a real soldier, or just someone's idea of a joke?" Sarah's fingers tightened on the nozzle, her jaw setting in irritation. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but today was different. Something inside her stirred. She wasn't going to let these idiots get away with it. Viper saw her stance, her stillness, and smirked. "What's the matter, tough girl? Too scared to answer?" He laughed again, his friends joining in. They had no idea the kind of trouble they had just stirred up. Sarah's gaze locked onto Viper's. "You're about to find out," she said coolly, her voice steady despite the rising anger inside her. "You're not going to do anything," Viper taunted, crossing his arms. "You're just a woman. What can you possibly do?" The air around Sarah grew thick with tension. She didn't need to say anything more. The bikers didn't know it yet, but they had just picked a fight with the wrong woman. What would you do in Sarah's shoes? Would you confront them, or just walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sarah "Hawk" Johnson wasn't just any soldier. She wasn't just the woman who could handle herself in a fight. She was a Navy SEAL, a title earned through years of grueling training and blood-soaked missions. To understand the strength Sarah had developed, you needed to know where she came from. Born and raised in a small town in Kansas, Sarah grew up in a family with military roots. Her father, Michael Johnson, was a decorated Marine who served in Vietnam. From a young age, Sarah knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Her father taught her everything she knew about resilience, discipline, and sacrifice. He wasn't the most affectionate man, but when he spoke about his experiences in the Marines, Sarah listened with a respect that transcended mere words. "Strength is not just about how hard you hit, Hawk," he'd always say. "It's about how hard you can get hit and still keep going." Those words became Sarah's mantra, guiding her through the toughest moments of her life. But even with her father's influence, the path she chose wasn't easy. As a teenager, Sarah wasn't your typical girl. While her peers were busy with prom dates and high school football games, Sarah was in the gym, lifting weights, running miles, and pushing her body to its limits. It wasn't that she hated being a girl. She just didn't see her gender as something that would hold her back. The day she enlisted in the Navy, her father's silence spoke volumes. He didn't say a word as she packed her things, but as she turned to walk out the door, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Make me proud, Hawk. Don't ever forget who you are." It was the only time he'd ever shown emotion about her decision. His approval meant everything. Basic training was brutal. Sarah had been pushed to the breaking point, physically and mentally. There were moments she wanted to quit. There were moments when she thought she wasn't cut out for it. But quitting wasn't an option. Not when she remembered her father's words. Not when she knew how much she had to prove to herself, and to everyone who had ever doubted her. After earning her SEAL Trident, Sarah was deployed to combat zones all over the world. From the deserts of the Middle East to covert operations in Central America, she saw and did things that changed her. But she carried those experiences with pride. Every mission, every obstacle, every victory was a reflection of her father's teachings. Despite the horrors of war, The toughest battles for Sarah were the ones that occurred outside of the battlefield. It wasn't the enemy that threatened her. It was the doubts from those who thought she didn't belong. The whispers from her fellow soldiers that women weren't cut out for this. The challenges of proving herself at every turn. But no matter what, Sarah pressed on. Her pride was in the work she did, not in the approval she sought from others. Have you ever faced doubts from others about your abilities? How did you prove them wrong? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Sarah slammed the door of her SUV shut, taking a deep breath as she started the engine. The sound of the motor roaring to life seemed to signal the end of the confrontation. But inside, Sarah felt a whirlwind of emotions she wasn't used to confronting. She had done what she had to do. She had stood her ground and sent a clear message. Yet, a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in her gut. The bikers had pushed her to the edge, and she had gone further than she ever intended. The violence had been swift, decisive, but it had still left a mark on her. It wasn't the physical bruises she was worried about. She didn't fear pain. It was the way she had had to fight, how close she had come to losing control. As she drove down the empty highway, the scenery became a blur. The endless stretch of desert felt suffocating, like a metaphor for her life. Always moving forward, but always alone. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant, on not needing anyone. But in that moment, as she reflected on the confrontation, she wondered if there was more to life than just surviving. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw it was a text from her old friend and fellow SEAL, Ben. "You okay? Heard about the incident. What happened?" Sarah sighed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't want to relive the fight, didn't want to explain herself. But Ben knew her better than anyone. He knew when she was hiding something. With a grunt, she typed a quick reply. "Fine. Just a bunch of idiots at a gas station. Nothing I couldn't handle." A few seconds later, the phone buzzed again. This time, Ben's message was blunt and to the point. "Be careful. You're pushing yourself too hard. Remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words stung more than she expected. Of course, she knew that. But she had spent so much of her life proving herself, fighting against people's doubts and misconceptions about her. Was there ever a time when it was enough? She didn't have an answer. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Ben. The number was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "We're not done. This isn't over. Watch your back." Her pulse quickened as the words hit her like a jolt of electricity. She had been in countless dangerous situations before, but something about this message made her feel uneasy. It wasn't just a threat. It was personal. She immediately began scanning the road, her eyes darting from rearview mirror to side window. The empty highway stretched for miles, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. It could have been paranoia, but her instincts were never wrong. The bikers were more than just a nuisance. They had been humiliated, and from what she knew about that crew, they didn't take well to losing. Viper's pride had been hurt, and pride could drive a man, or a group of men, to do reckless things. Sarah's thoughts raced as she gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had made it clear to them that she wasn't someone to be taken lightly, but she knew that their desire for revenge could be far more dangerous than their initial taunts. The road ahead seemed endless. But for Sarah, it was clear. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Do you think Sarah should have stayed and faced the consequences of her actions, or would you have tried to leave the situation behind? What would you do if you received a threatening message like that? Let us know your thoughts below. Sarah's eyes scanned the rearview mirror for what felt like the 100th time. The feeling of being followed persisted. She told herself it was probably just her mind playing tricks on her, that the stress of the confrontation with the bikers had her on edge. But the more she drove, the more certain she became that she wasn't imagining it. Her grip tightened around the steering wheel as she pressed the pedal a little harder. The SUV hummed along the empty road, but the nagging sensation wouldn't go away. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, but there were no other cars in sight. She was alone. But then, a flash of headlights appeared in the distance. At first, it seemed like nothing, just another vehicle on the highway. But as it drew closer, Sarah's gut twisted. The vehicle wasn't speeding past her like the others. Instead, it was slowly closing the distance. Whoever was driving was taking their time, as if they wanted to stay just close enough to watch her. She cursed under her breath and made a sharp turn into a small, run-down diner on the side of the road. It was a last-minute decision. She wasn't sure what she expected, but she needed to get off the main highway and out of view for a while. She parked quickly and shut off the engine, watching in the rearview mirror. The car that had been tailing her also turned into the diner parking lot. Her heart pounded. It was a beat-up black truck, the kind that blended into the background and was designed to be overlooked. The truck slowed to a stop right behind her SUV. Sarah's fingers itched to reach for her sidearm, but she resisted the urge. She had no way of knowing if the person in that truck was a threat, or worse, if it was one of the bikers seeking revenge. She glanced out the window. The truck's engine shut off, and the door opened. A man in a dark jacket stepped out, tall, with a scruffy beard and sunglasses that masked his face. He didn't look like he was in a hurry. He moved with a calm confidence, the kind of man who was used to being in control. Sarah exhaled slowly, reaching for her own door handle. If it came down to it, she was ready. She couldn't risk another fight today, but she wasn't about to run either. Her boots hit the ground with a soft thud as she stepped out of the SUV, her eyes trained on the man as he approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cool but firm, a tone that let him know she wasn't intimidated. The man stopped just a few feet from her, keeping his distance. "I think you've got some people looking for you," he said, his voice rough. "You made a pretty big impression at the gas station. Viper's not the type to forget a fight." Her mind raced. So, this guy wasn't with the bikers, but he clearly knew who she was and what had happened. "I'm not looking for any more trouble," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. "If you're here to warn me, I appreciate it, but I've handled things before. I'll handle them again." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not here to fight you. I just came to tell you that Viper's crew doesn't forget slights like that. You're gonna have more on your tail than just a few angry bikers if you keep pushing. You should be careful." "Thanks for the advice," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady, though a part of her couldn't ignore the cold knot in her stomach. This was more serious than she had thought. "But I've been dealing with threats my whole life. I don't need to be babysat." The man smirked, a knowing look in his eyes. "Maybe not, but everyone could use a little help now and then. Just thought you might want to know, there's more than just the bikers you've pissed off. I've got a feeling you'll be seeing me again soon." Before she could respond, he turned and walked back to the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't look back, and without another word, he got in, started the engine, and drove off, leaving Sarah standing there with more questions than answers. As the truck disappeared down the highway, Sarah's unease only deepened. Who was that man? And why had he seemed so certain that trouble was coming for her? The warning was clear. This wasn't just about Viper and his crew anymore. There was something much bigger at play, and Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. She turned and walked back toward her SUV, her mind racing. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was for sure. She couldn't trust anyone, not even the man who had warned her. Whoever was pulling the strings behind the bikers, they weren't going to stop until they had everything they wanted. And Sarah had a feeling she was going to be at the center of it all. What do you think of the mysterious man's warning? Do you think he's telling the truth, or does he have his own agenda? Share your thoughts below. Sarah didn't sleep that night. The hours passed in a haze, her mind constantly replaying the events of the day. The warning from the stranger, the mystery surrounding the bikers, and the sudden shift in her reality. Everything felt off. The empty highway she'd been driving on just a few hours earlier now felt like a trap, a place where she was bound to collide with something or someone she wasn't prepared for. She sat in the worn booth of a nearby diner, nursing a cup of coffee. The warmth from the mug offered little comfort, and the greasy smell of eggs and bacon in the air only added to her sense of unease. Her eyes kept flicking toward the window, watching the passing cars. There was no sign of the black truck, no indication that anyone was following her. But Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen. Another message from Ben. "I know you're busy, but I need you to meet me. You're not alone in this. The bikers and whoever's behind them are connected. Trust me on this one." Sarah frowned. Ben wasn't one to get involved in things that didn't concern him, especially after their time in the SEALs. If he was reaching out, something bigger was going on. But she wasn't about to trust him blindly. Not with the stakes so high. Still, the message struck a chord with her. Maybe he knew something she didn't. Or maybe, just maybe, he had seen the bigger picture all along. She tapped out a quick response. Where? A minute later, Ben replied with a location. An old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was an unusual place for a meeting. But then again, Ben had always preferred to keep things off the radar. Sarah stood up, slipping her phone into her jacket pocket. As she made her way toward the door, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the diner's window. Her expression was hard, her face set in determination. It wasn't the first time she had faced danger, but something about this situation felt different, personal, as if the stakes were higher than just her survival. The drive to the warehouse was long and quiet, the road winding through dark stretches of farmland before opening up to the industrial area. The place was desolate, the tall metal walls of abandoned buildings towering over the cracked pavement. It didn't look like the kind of place anyone would want to be, and that was exactly why Sarah trusted it. When she arrived, Ben's car was parked in the far corner of the lot, a silver sedan hidden behind a row of dumpsters. Sarah parked beside him and stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel as she made her way to the entrance. She pushed open the door to the warehouse, the rusted hinges groaning as it swung inward. The dim light inside cast long shadows across the space, and Sarah's eyes quickly adjusted. She spotted Ben leaning against a stack of crates near the back, arms crossed, looking every bit the soldier she remembered. He hadn't changed much in the years since they served together. He still had that same sharp, no-nonsense look in his eyes. "Sarah," Ben said, his voice low but urgent. "Glad you came. I don't know how much time we have." She nodded, her gaze shifting toward the back of the warehouse. "What's going on, Ben? You said the bikers are connected to something bigger. What aren't you telling me?" Ben hesitated for a moment, then uncrossed his arms, his expression darkening. "There's a faction moving through this town. Viper's crew is just one part of it. But there's more to this, something behind the scenes. I've been tracking them for months, and they've been getting bolder." Sarah narrowed her eyes, her heart rate picking up. "Who are they?" Ben stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't have all the details yet, but I know they're working with people who have connections far beyond this town. And they're not just in it for the chaos. They've got plans that could bring down a lot more than just a few bikers." Sarah processed the information quickly. She had known that there was something bigger at play. The bikers weren't just a random threat, but a piece of a much larger puzzle. Her instinct had been right. "Why are you involved in this, Ben?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on his. "You've been out of this life for a while." Ben's jaw clenched. "You know as well as I do that we can't just walk away from this kind of thing. If they've been pushing on your side, it's only a matter of time before they come after others. I'm just trying to help you stop it before it gets out of hand." Sarah looked away, her mind racing. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. She had learned long ago that the only person she could trust was herself. But Ben had been her partner in the field, and his instincts had saved her life more than once. For the first time since the encounter at the gas station, Sarah considered that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this after all. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "I'm in. But if we're doing this, we do it my way." Ben smiled, the same old grin she had always known. "You never were one for following orders." Before they could discuss further, a loud bang echoed from the far side of the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of tires screeching on the asphalt outside. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "It's them," Ben muttered. "They found us." Do you think Sarah made the right decision in agreeing to meet with Ben? Do you trust Ben's involvement, or do you think he has his own agenda? What would you do in Sarah's shoes right now? Let us know your thoughts. The screeching tires outside grew louder, signaling that whoever was coming wasn't wasting any time. Sarah's instincts kicked in, and she immediately scanned the room for cover. Her eyes flicked to the shadows in the far corners of the warehouse. The air felt charged with tension, and her muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. "Get down!" she hissed at Ben, grabbing his arm and pulling him behind the nearest stack of crates. Ben didn't hesitate, dropping to the ground beside her. The sound of footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, and the unmistakable metallic clink of weapons being readied sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She motioned for Ben to stay silent as she peeked over the top of the crate, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the figures emerging from the shadows. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, dressed in tactical gear. They were armed, moving with military precision, and their faces were covered with masks. This wasn't a random biker gang. This was something far more organized. "Looks like they've come to shut us down," Ben whispered, his voice tight with barely contained tension. Sarah nodded, her mind already working on a plan. She reached for her sidearm, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the holstered weapon, and checked the chamber. 1 shot, and she could take out 2 of them. But that would only buy them a few seconds, and there was no way to predict how many more were outside. The footsteps grew closer, echoing in the cavernous warehouse. Sarah's heart pounded as the figures stopped just feet from their hiding spot. She could hear their muffled voices, but couldn't make out what they were saying. Her grip tightened on her gun. Ben shifted slightly, his expression grim. "We can't stay hidden forever. We need to move." But before Sarah could respond, the door at the far end of the warehouse slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. A man entered, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same cold, calculating eyes Sarah had seen on the stranger who had warned her earlier. He was flanked by a couple of his crew, their weapons raised and ready. "Sarah Riley," the man said, his voice booming through the empty space. "We've been looking for you." Sarah's stomach dropped as she stood to her feet, gun raised and aimed directly at the newcomer. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. She didn't recognize the man, but his presence was enough to send a chill through her. The man smirked, unbothered by the gun trained on him. "Does it matter? I'm the one who's going to make sure you don't interfere with our plans." He motioned to the 2 men and 2 women who flanked him. "Deal with her." Before Sarah could react, one of the women lunged toward her, moving with surprising speed. Sarah sidestepped, using the woman's momentum to send her crashing into a nearby crate. The sound of bones hitting would echo through the space, but Sarah didn't have time to check if the woman was unconscious. She turned just in time to see one of the men draw a knife and charge at her. "Ben!" she shouted, ducking under the swing of the blade. Ben, who had been silently surveying the situation, immediately leapt into action. He tackled the knife-wielding man to the ground, twisting the blade from his hand and disarming him with military precision. Sarah didn't hesitate. She fired 2 quick shots, the first striking one of the other women in the shoulder, the second sending the remaining man stumbling back, clutching his leg where the bullet had grazed him. The warehouse exploded into chaos. The air was thick with tension, the sound of gunshots and grunts of pain reverberating off the metal walls. Sarah could hear the sound of more footsteps approaching, heavier this time, and realized they were being surrounded. She wasn't sure how many were out there, but she knew they had little time before they were overwhelmed. Ben grunted as he wrestled the man to the ground, knocking the air out of him with a well-placed punch. Sarah kept her focus, scanning the room for an exit. The overhead catwalk seemed like their best chance. If they could get up there, they could move with more cover, at least long enough to make their escape. "Ben, we need to move," she shouted, barely avoiding another strike from the woman she had thrown into the crate earlier. She ducked, using her shoulder to knock the woman off balance, and took the chance to sprint toward the staircase that led to the catwalk. Ben followed her lead, but the moment they reached the top of the stairs, a burst of gunfire rang out, sending sparks flying from the steel beams above them. Sarah immediately ducked, pulling Ben down with her. "Damn it," Ben muttered, scanning the shadows below. "We've got company." Sarah's mind raced. She needed to think fast, or they wouldn't make it out of here alive. She spotted an old ventilation shaft above them, its rusty grills barely hanging on by a few screws. "Up there," Sarah said, pointing to the shaft. "We can use it to get out." Ben nodded and moved toward it, helping Sarah climb up first. She reached the opening, wedging her body into the narrow space. Just as Ben followed her, more gunfire rang out, narrowly missing them. The sound of boots pounding against the steel stairs below made Sarah's heart race. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Get moving." The two of them crawled through the cramped ventilation duct, the sound of shouting and gunshots still echoing from the warehouse below. They moved as quickly as possible, each moment feeling like an eternity. Sarah could feel the sweat running down her back as they crawled through the narrow passages, the metallic taste of fear lingering in her mouth. Finally, they reached the end of the duct, where a small access panel opened to the outside. Sarah pushed it open cautiously, peering out into the night. The quiet of the desert air felt like a brief reprieve from the chaos inside the warehouse, but she knew it wouldn't last long. "Let's go," she said, stepping into the open air, followed closely by Ben. The two of them moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows as they headed for her SUV. The danger wasn't over yet, but for the first time that night, Sarah felt like they had gained some ground. What do you think of the intense battle in the warehouse? Do you think Sarah and Ben made the right choice by escaping through the duct? What's next for them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The desert night was cold, and the wind blew dust and debris across the empty streets, but Sarah couldn't afford to stop and take a breath. Her pulse was still pounding in her ears, her mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. They had escaped the warehouse, but it wasn't a clean getaway. The group that had attacked them wasn't just a random bunch of criminals. They were organized, trained, and dangerous. Sarah slid into the driver's seat of her SUV, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Ben climbed in beside her, slamming the door shut behind him. His face was flushed with exertion, but his eyes were sharp, alert. "That was too close," he muttered, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Who were those people?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she fired up the engine, the growl of the SUV's engine cutting through the stillness. She needed a plan, and quickly. Whoever these people were, they weren't just after her. They were after something bigger. She was certain of that. The attack at the warehouse had been no random act of violence. It was a message. "I don't know yet," she finally replied, her voice low and contemplative, "but I'm going to find out. They wanted me alive. For what, though? That's the question." Ben glanced at her, his face tense. "You can't do this alone, Sarah. Those people, they weren't just thugs. They had the look of someone with a bigger agenda." Sarah shot him a glance, but kept her eyes on the road. "I'm not alone. Not anymore." Ben gave a small grunt, then settled into the seat, clearly choosing not to argue further. He knew better than anyone that Sarah didn't work well with help, but he also knew how dangerous it was to go up against an enemy like this without allies. They drove in silence for a few miles, the distant glow of streetlights flickering in the rearview mirror as Sarah weaved through the empty streets. Her mind churned, calculating their next move. They couldn't afford to go to the police. Whoever these people were, they had connections everywhere. The police might be in on it. She had to stay one step ahead, figure out who was pulling the strings. The road stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark landscape. Then, a sudden thought hit her. She needed to find someone who could help them navigate this web of danger. "Ben," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Do you remember Leo?" Ben stiffened at the name. Leo was a former teammate, a quiet and reliable guy who had specialized in intelligence and hacking during their time in the SEALs. After their service, Leo had disappeared off the grid, and no one had heard from him in years. But if anyone could dig up the information Sarah needed, it was him. "I thought he was off the radar," Ben replied, his voice skeptical. "You really think he'll help us?" "He doesn't have a choice," Sarah said with a grim smile. "He owes me." Ben sighed, but he didn't argue. They both knew that Leo had a tendency to show up when things got really complicated. He was a wild card, but he was also a genius with tech and data. If anyone could track down the people behind the attack, it was Leo. Sarah turned off the main road, heading toward the outskirts of the town. She wasn't sure exactly where Leo was hiding, but she had a few leads. His last known location had been a cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. The drive took about an hour. By the time they reached the cabin, Sarah's nerves were on edge again. Every car that passed seemed like a potential threat, every rustling bush or shadow a sign of danger. But the cabin itself looked quiet, tucked away behind a thick stand of trees. There were no signs of life. No indication that anyone was there. "Stay here," Sarah ordered Ben as she parked the SUV behind the cabin. "I'll check it out first." Ben nodded silently, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he looked around warily. He trusted Sarah's judgment, but he also knew that the last thing they needed right now was to be caught off guard. Sarah got out of the car, her boots crunching on the gravel path that led up to the door. She approached cautiously, her senses alert. There was a strange stillness in the air, and the faint smell of wood smoke hung in the breeze. She reached for the door handle, but before she could open it, she paused. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and her gut told her something was wrong. She stepped back, scanning the area. She had trained herself to read subtle signs of danger, and everything about this place felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just as she reached for her phone to text Ben, the door creaked open. Sarah's hand shot to her gun, but the figure standing in the doorway stopped her. "Sarah Riley," Leo said, his voice raspy from disuse but still sharp. He was thin, his face scruffy with a few days' worth of stubble, but his eyes were as calculating as ever. "It's been a while." "Leo," Sarah replied, her tone even. "We need your help." Leo eyed her, then glanced past her toward Ben sitting in the car. "You brought a friend. Interesting." He stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in. You've got questions. I've got answers." The inside of the cabin was exactly what Sarah remembered. A mess of old furniture, computer equipment, and stacks of papers. It was a cozy disaster, one that only someone like Leo could call home. He had clearly been living here for some time, but it looked like he had also been doing some work. The computer monitors on the desk were filled with code and surveillance footage, some of it recent. Sarah stepped inside, her mind already racing with questions. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. If Leo had been involved in any way with the people who had attacked her, she needed to know now. "All right, Leo," she said, her voice sharp. "We're running out of time. What do you know about the bikers? And about the people who are after us?" Leo raised an eyebrow, then sat down at his desk, swiveling his chair to face them. "Sit down. I've got something that might just blow your mind." "What do you think Leo knows? Do you trust him to help Sarah? Or is there something he's hiding? What do you think the next big twist will be in this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below." The air in Leo's cabin was thick with the musty smell of old papers and the faint, electric hum of computer monitors. The flickering glow of the screens cast an eerie light across the room, creating deep shadows in every corner. Sarah and Ben took their seats across from Leo, the tension palpable in the small, cluttered space. Sarah could feel her heartbeat quicken as she waited for Leo to speak. Leo leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of him as if savoring the moment. For a brief second, he seemed to enjoy the suspense, but the old hacker wasn't one to keep people waiting too long. He let out a slow breath, then turned back to his screens. "You've stumbled into something much bigger than you realize," Leo said, his voice low and serious. "And I don't think you fully understand who's pulling the strings here." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I've been hunted by a group of armed, trained people who knew exactly where I was. They didn't just show up at random. Who are they?" Leo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he typed something quickly on his keyboard, and a series of images flickered across the screen. A collection of faces, names, and locations. Sarah leaned in, scanning them as they appeared. The faces were familiar, but not in the way she expected. They were people she had never met before, but somehow felt connected to the operation that had almost cost her her life. "These are members of a network," Leo said, pointing to the screen. "Not just bikers, like you thought. These are mercenaries, part of an international syndicate. They're highly trained, and they don't take assignments lightly. Whoever hired them is very well connected." Ben shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled. "You're saying they're mercenaries? Not just some local gang?" Leo nodded. "Exactly. And they've been following your movements for months. The thing is, they aren't just after you. They're after something or someone that's connected to your past." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had a sinking feeling in her gut. "What does that mean, exactly?" Leo paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "There's a man named Victor Kovalchuk. You probably haven't heard of him, but he's a major player in the global arms trade. He's been operating under the radar for years, and from what I've gathered, he's connected to your old military team. In fact, I believe you're the key to his operation. Sarah felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Viktor Kovalchuk. The name was unfamiliar, but the way Leo said it made her stomach churn. She thought back to her time in the SEALs, to the classified missions that had blurred the lines between right and wrong. She had never gotten too close to the darker side of military work, but it seemed her past was catching up with her. "You're saying Kovalchuk is behind this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo nodded. "Yes, and he's got people everywhere. Government, military, law enforcement. I'm betting one of the reasons they're targeting you is because you were involved in a mission that went south. There are people who would kill to keep the details of that operation under wraps." Ben leaned forward, his expression hardening. "So, what does this have to do with us? Why come after Sarah now?" Leo's eyes flicked over to Sarah. "Because you were part of a team that had direct access to sensitive information, and someone has found out about it. Someone powerful." Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The memories from her time in the field, the missions she couldn't talk about, the people she had trusted. But one thing was clear. There was more to this than just a group of mercenaries or some random attack. This was about secrets, and people would kill to keep them hidden. "So what now?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but filled with determination. "How do we stop this?" Leo stood up, walking to a filing cabinet and pulling out a thick folder. He opened it and spread several pages across the table. "I've been tracking Kovalchuk's movements for months. He's been working his way through the military and private contractors, building a private army. But there's something else you need to know." He pointed to a name on one of the pages, circled in red. "There's a person in your past who may hold the key to everything. Someone you trusted." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she scanned the name. Her pulse quickened as a wave of recognition hit her. "This is impossible," she muttered under her breath. Ben leaned over, reading the name on the page. "Who is it?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her mind was in turmoil, her thoughts racing back to a time long buried. There was only one person who could be connected to this. Someone she had fought alongside, someone who had vanished without a trace years ago. "It's Michael Steele," Sarah finally said, her voice heavy with disbelief. Leo's eyes widened. "You know him?" Sarah nodded slowly. "We were on the same team. He disappeared during a mission in South America 5 years ago. No one ever found him. I assumed he was dead." Leo gave her a sharp look. "Michael Steele isn't dead. He's very much alive, and he's been working with Kovalchuk. If you want to stop this, you need to find him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah's mind was reeling. Michael Steele had been one of the most skilled operatives she'd ever worked with, but he had also been secretive, often slipping in and out of operations without leaving a trace. If he had been working with Viktor Kovalchuk, it meant everything she had known about him, everything she thought she knew, was a lie. "You said he was working with Kovalchuk," Ben said, his voice tight with suspicion. "What's his role in all this?" Leo glanced between them, his expression grim. "He's not just an operative. Steele's the link between Kovalchuk's operation and the military. He's been using his access to the SEALs and other military units to funnel resources to Kovalchuk. And now, he's pulling the strings behind these attacks on you." Sarah clenched her jaw, the weight of everything hitting her like a freight train. Michael Steele, her old teammate, someone she had trusted, was now her enemy. "Where is he?" Sarah asked, her voice cold and determined. Leo hesitated, then pointed to a map on the wall. "The last intel I have puts him in a compound in northern Mexico. It's heavily guarded, but if you can get to him, you might be able to stop Kovalchuk's entire operation." Ben stood up, his face set in a hard line. "Let's go. We can't waste any more time." Sarah nodded, already moving to the door. "We find Steele, and we bring him down." Do you think Sarah can trust Michael Steele, or is he too far gone to be saved? What do you think will happen when Sarah confronts him? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments below. The next few hours felt like a blur. After Leo gave them the location, Sarah and Ben quickly gathered their gear, making sure they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Leo had provided all the intel he could, but they both knew that tracking Michael Steele down in Mexico wouldn't be easy. The compound where he was hiding was heavily fortified, and if what Leo said was true, they were walking straight into the lion's den. As Sarah and Ben drove out of the cabin's dirt road and back onto the main highway, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were running out of time. Every mile they drove took them closer to Mexico, but it also brought them closer to a confrontation that could change everything. "Do you really think Steele's working with Kovalchuk?" Ben asked, his voice cutting through the quiet, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Sarah didn't answer right away. She was still processing everything Leo had told them. Michael Steele had been her teammate, someone she trusted with her life. They'd fought side by side through countless missions, but now she was faced with the horrifying possibility that he might be the reason behind everything. The mercenaries, the attacks on her, the whole operation. "I don't know," Sarah finally replied. "But if Leo's right, Steele's the missing piece to all of this. And if he's working for Kovalchuk, he's a threat. We can't afford to wait." Ben nodded. He didn't need further explanation. They both knew that once they crossed the border, they were stepping into enemy territory. The border crossing was uneventful, at least on the surface. Sarah had used a series of fake IDs and was prepared for any possible search, but there was something about the place that made her feel uneasy. She had been in and out of different countries before, but this felt different. This wasn't just another operation. This was personal. Once they were through, they drove south toward the compound. The landscape changed as they neared the desert outskirts. Dusty roads stretched into the horizon, and the heat was suffocating. Sarah had been through this part of the world before, but nothing had prepared her for the feeling of being hunted like she was now. She couldn't help but glance over at Ben, who was silently scanning the surroundings. "Keep your eyes peeled," Sarah said, her voice low. "We're getting close." Ben gave a curt nod and reached for his sidearm, his hand brushing against the cold metal. They both knew this mission could go sideways at any moment. They were deep in enemy territory, and their enemies had already shown they weren't afraid to kill. As they approached the compound, Sarah's mind raced. Michael Steele. He had been part of their team, but something had changed. Something had made him walk away from everything they had fought for and align himself with Viktor Kovalchuk. The betrayal stung, and it only fueled Sarah's resolve. She wasn't just going to stop Kovalchuk's operation. She was going to bring Steele to justice for what he'd done. The compound was nothing like Sarah had imagined. It was a sprawling complex, nestled in the middle of a barren stretch of desert. Barbed wire topped the perimeter fence, and there were guards at every entrance. From a distance, it looked like a fortress, a place where only the most dangerous individuals would reside. But Sarah wasn't deterred. She had faced far worse odds. They parked the car a few miles away, in a small cluster of scrub brush. From there, they would have to approach on foot, blending into the landscape as best they could. Sarah checked her equipment, her gun, her knife, her gear, and motioned for Ben to follow. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the nerves tightening in her chest. Ben gave her a firm nod. "Let's do this." They moved silently, using the darkness to cover their movements. As they neared the perimeter of the compound, Sarah's mind sharpened. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to pump through her veins, her senses on high alert. She had been in situations like this before, but this time, it felt different. This time, there was something personal on the line. "I'll go first," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "You follow." Ben nodded again, his face set with grim determination. They both dropped to the ground, landing in a crouch. The compound was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of a generator and the occasional clink of metal. They moved swiftly but cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they made their way toward the main building. The security cameras were few and far between, but they were still a threat. Sarah kept her eyes peeled for them, and with each step, her pulse quickened. When they reached the back of the building, Sarah paused, signaling for Ben to stop. She scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. The back door was heavily guarded, but there was a window just to the left of it, slightly ajar. It was their best chance. Sarah climbed up to the window, her muscles burning from the effort. She peered inside, making sure no one was watching. It was clear. On three, she mouthed to Ben. 1, 2, 3. They both squeezed through the window, landing silently on the other side. Inside, the building was dimly lit, filled with a stark, industrial atmosphere. They were in what looked like a storage area, stacked with crates and equipment. Sarah took a quick breath, listening intently for any sounds of movement. The tension was unbearable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. "Steele's somewhere in here," Sarah muttered, scanning the room. "We just need to find him before they do." What do you think will happen when Sarah finally confronts Steele? Will he fight back or reveal something unexpected? What kind of showdown do you imagine they'll have in the compound? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The dim light inside the compound's storage room flickered as Sarah and Ben crept through the shadows. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and machinery. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she moved toward the corridor that led deeper into the building. Every sound felt amplified in the silence. The squeak of her boots on the concrete floor, the rustle of fabric as Ben adjusted his stance. They were so close now, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Steele's somewhere ahead," Sarah whispered, her voice low but steady. "We need to find him before anyone else does." Ben gave a brief nod, his hand tightening around his weapon. "Stay sharp." They continued down the corridor, passing through a series of dark rooms and hallways, always alert for any signs of movement. The compound was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Sarah's instinct screamed at her that something wasn't right, that they were walking into a trap. But she couldn't afford to turn back now. She had to face Steele, even if it meant everything was about to change. They reached a heavy metal door, its surface scarred and scratched from years of use. Sarah stopped and checked the handle, locked. Without a word, she knelt to work on the lock, her hands moving quickly, efficiently, the way she'd been trained. The seconds dragged by, each one feeling like a small eternity. Finally, with a soft click, the door swung open. Beyond the door was a dimly lit room, filled with computers and equipment that hummed with power. At the far end of the room, Sarah saw him, Michael Steele. He was sitting behind a desk, his back to them. His posture was relaxed, almost as if he hadn't noticed their arrival. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There he was, the man she had trusted, the man who had disappeared 5 years ago, the man she now knew had turned against everything they had fought for. Steele didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he typed something on the computer in front of him, his fingers moving with a precision that made Sarah's stomach churn. When he finally swiveled his chair to face them, his eyes locked on hers, cold and calculating. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant. "I didn't think I'd see you again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of history between them hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the bond they once shared. But it was a bond that had been shattered by betrayal, by secrets, by lies. "Why, Steele?" Sarah's voice was steady, but the pain was undeniable. "Why did you do it? Why did you turn on us?" "On me?" Steele's expression didn't falter. "I did what I had to do. Kovalchuk offered me something that your government never could. Power, control, freedom. You know how it works, Sarah. You've seen what happens when people are pushed to their limits. You've seen what people are willing to do when they've had enough." Sarah shook her head, her fists clenching at her sides. "This isn't freedom. This is destruction. You've been working with Kovalchuk, feeding him information, using your connections to build his empire. You've been the one pulling the strings behind all of this, haven't you?" Steele didn't flinch. "It's not as simple as you think. This world isn't black and white, Sarah. It never was. I didn't join Kovalchuk because I wanted to destroy everything we fought for. I joined him because I wanted to build something new, something that actually works." Ben stepped forward, his voice low and tense. "You're still the same, Steele. You think you're above it all, don't you? But you're just a pawn in Kovalchuk's game. You've sold your soul." For the first time, something flickered in Steele's eyes, a brief flash of doubt, quickly masked. But it was enough to make Sarah realize that there was still a part of him, somewhere deep inside, that wasn't completely lost. Maybe I am a pawn, Steele said, leaning back in his chair. But I'm not the only one. Everyone has their price. You've worked for the system. Sarah, you were willing to break the rules when it suited you. Kovalchuk's no different. He just plays the game better. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't the man she had known. This wasn't the teammate she had trusted. The years of camaraderie, of shared battles, now seemed like a distant memory, twisted by the reality of what he had become. You were family, Steele, Sarah said, her voice raw with emotion. You were like a brother to me. And now, I'm standing here, staring at the man who's been hunting me, trying to kill me. How did it come to this? For a moment, Steele didn't respond. His gaze softened, just for a moment, before he let out a quiet sigh. The world changes, Sarah. People change. You should know that better than anyone. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she realized the truth in his words. He had become the very thing she had feared, a symbol of what could happen when someone loses sight of everything they once stood for. And now, she was left with no choice but to stop him. Steele, Sarah said firmly, her eyes locking with his, you're not the man I used to know, and I can't let you keep doing this. I can't let you continue to work with Kovalchuk and feed his operation. I'm going to bring you down. Steele's lips twisted into a smirk, but there was no humor in it, only cold bitterness. You really think you can stop me, Sarah? You've always been a good soldier, but you've never understood the bigger picture. You've never seen how far the game goes. Before Sarah could respond, a loud noise erupted from behind them, a heavy door slamming open. Both Sarah and Ben spun around, weapons drawn, to see several armed men pouring into the room, their guns raised. The situation had just escalated. We'll see who understands the bigger picture, Steele, Sarah muttered under her breath. Ben took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the new threat. We need to move now. But Steele didn't seem concerned. He stood up slowly, his face hardening. It's too late for you, Sarah. Too late for all of us. With a sudden motion, he lunged toward the desk, hitting a hidden button that triggered the release of a steel gate behind him. The compound was sealed off, and the escape route had just been blocked. The standoff is heating up. Do you think Sarah can still reach Michael Steele, or has he gone too far down the path of no return? What will happen next in this high-stakes confrontation? Share your predictions in the comments below. The door to the outside world loomed in front of them, a thin barrier between the danger inside and the uncertain freedom that lay beyond. Sarah's breath was heavy as she moved, the adrenaline pumping through her veins, urging her forward. Her eyes remained fixed on the exit, but every instinct told her something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something was waiting for them out there, and it wasn't a group of friendly faces. Stay alert, Sarah muttered under her breath, her grip on her weapon tightening. Ben, just a few steps behind her, gave a sharp nod, his eyes scanning the area, clearly sensing the same unease. They were so close. Just a few more steps, and they would be free. The compound was still full of enemies, but they had made it this far. The thought of Steele, injured and helpless, kept her moving forward. She couldn't let him go back to Kovalchuk. No matter what he had become, he still had information that could destroy the network Kovalchuk was building. With one last push, Sarah shoved the heavy door open, stepping into the harsh, dry air of the desert night. The chill of the desert wind hit her face, but it wasn't the weather that made her blood run cold. It was the dozen armed men waiting for them in the open space just outside the door. They were spread out in a semicircle, their weapons raised, faces hidden behind dark masks. The moment the door swung open, they had raised their guns and locked onto their targets. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The ambush was set. This wasn't just a random group of hired guns. These men were too organized, too precise. They were part of Kovalchuk's elite security team. And if they were here, it meant Kovalchuk himself had gotten wind of their escape. Steele, Sarah hissed, pulling him close. Stay behind me. We'll get through this, but you need to stay low. Ben stepped in front of her, already shifting into a defensive position. We don't have much time. We're outnumbered, but we can fight our way through if we stay coordinated. The men before them moved in sync, like a well-oiled machine. They were blocking every possible route of escape, their eyes narrowed behind the masks. There was no way to outgun them, not without taking heavy casualties. But there was something Sarah could do. She just needed to outsmart them. "We don't want to do this," Sarah called out, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. "We can walk away. Just let us go." One of the men chuckled darkly. "Walk away? Not after everything you've done. Steele's worth more than you think. You're not leaving here alive." The word stung. Steele's betrayal had led them to this moment, had led to his own capture. But even now, Sarah couldn't help the small part of her that wished things had turned out differently. Ben didn't wait for more talk. With one swift movement, he raised his weapon and fired 2 shots, one hitting the nearest man in the shoulder, the other knocking the gun from his hand. The ambush had officially started. The echo of gunfire split the night air, and chaos erupted. Sarah was already in motion, ducking behind the nearest stack of crates, using the cover to advance. She moved quickly, methodically, as she fired at the men attempting to flank them. Her shots were precise, but the enemies were just as well trained. They ducked, shifted positions, and returned fire in a series of calculated bursts. Ben was moving with her, his aim sharp, taking out targets with deadly precision. Every movement seemed choreographed, as though they had rehearsed this hundreds of times. But despite their skill, the odds were against them. The enemies were coming from every angle. "Keep moving," Ben shouted over the sound of gunfire. "We have to get to the truck. It's the only way out." Sarah nodded, gritting her teeth as she fired another round, taking down an approaching soldier. Her eyes flickered to Steele, who was crouched behind cover, his face pale with fear but still conscious. He was the reason they were fighting for their lives right now, and she hated herself for it. But there was no time for regret. As they fought their way through the perimeter of the compound, Sarah noticed something. Something that almost seemed too good to be true. The enemy soldiers were moving in a pattern, like they were being led by someone. And then, she saw him. Standing on a small rise above them, overlooking the scene, was none other than Kovalchuk himself. His icy blue eyes met hers, a predatory grin curling on his lips as he surveyed the battlefield below. "Sarah," he called, his voice carrying effortlessly over the chaos. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You've been quite a thorn in my side." There was no mistaking the cold arrogance in his tone. Kovalchuk had always been one to play games, but this time, it was personal. He had orchestrated this ambush. He had been waiting for Sarah to come to him, and now he had her right where he wanted her. "Come out, Sarah," Kovalchuk continued, his grin widening. "I don't bite, unless you force me to." The taunt sent a wave of fury through Sarah. She had dealt with men like Kovalchuk before. Men who thought they were untouchable, men who thought they could control everything. But she wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. "We're not done yet," Sarah muttered under her breath. She turned to Ben, who was already scanning the area, his mind working to come up with their next move. "Ben, get Steele to the truck," she ordered. "I'll handle Kovalchuk." Ben's eyes flashed with concern. "Sarah, don't." "Now," she barked, cutting him off. With a resigned nod, Ben grabbed Steele and started moving toward the truck parked at the far end of the compound, where the last of the armed men were trying to flank them. Sarah stayed behind, focused on Kovalchuk. He was still standing on the rise, watching them, daring her to come for him. Kovalchuk raised a hand and gestured to his men, signaling for them to spread out and flank her. They were closing in, but Sarah wasn't backing down. She had one chance at this, one chance to end it all. With a deep breath, she sprinted forward, her gun raised, and the final confrontation began. The moment of truth is here. Will Sarah be able to confront Kovalchuk and end this once and for all? Or will she fall into his trap? What's your prediction for the final showdown? Share your thoughts below. The night air was still, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted toward Kovalchuk's position, dodging gunfire from his men. Each step she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into the storm, into the final confrontation that would either end her mission or her life. Her mind raced with thoughts of what had brought her here. The years of training, the missions, the betrayals, and now, the one person who had always been one step ahead, Vladimir Kovalchuk. This wasn't just another mission. This was personal. This was about justice. About stopping him before his plans could take hold of the world. Kovalchuk's cold blue eyes locked onto hers, and that grin of his only grew wider as she approached. He looked unfazed, almost like he was waiting for her to make a mistake. "Sarah," he called, his voice carrying over the battlefield, mocking her resolve. "You're quite resilient, I'll give you that. But this is where it ends. You think you've won? You're still a pawn in a game you can't even comprehend." Sarah didn't respond. Words wouldn't help her now. She was done talking. She was done letting him control the narrative. Her gun was raised, and with every step, she closed the distance between them. Behind her, the sound of Ben's shots rang out. He was covering her escape route, making sure that the truck and Steele made it out of this hellhole alive. But Sarah's focus was on Kovalchuk now. She couldn't afford to let anything distract her. "You've been playing with fire for too long," Kovalchuk continued, his voice low but laced with venom. "You have no idea how deep this goes, do you? You think you're just stopping me, but I've already won. It's already too late." Sarah's breath was steady, her pulse regulated. She had trained for moments like this. Moments when everything seemed lost, when the world was telling her to give up. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. As Kovalchuk stepped forward, he raised his own weapon, aiming directly at her. "Say goodbye, Sarah." In that split second, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Kovalchuk's finger was tightening on the trigger. The air was thick with the anticipation of the final shot. But Sarah had already anticipated his move. She dove to the side, rolling as the shot rang out, missing her by inches. Before he could react, Sarah was already on her feet, her gun trained on his chest. She fired twice, twice, each bullet finding its mark. The first hit his shoulder, the second grazed his side. He staggered back but didn't fall. "Is that all you've got?" Kovalchuk sneered, wiping the blood from his shoulder with the back of his hand. He didn't seem fazed by the injury. It was clear now that his resolve wasn't as fragile as the others she had fought. Kovalchuk was no ordinary adversary. Sarah was quick to reload, moving cautiously as Kovalchuk began to circle her. She needed to end this now. She couldn't keep dancing around this fight. He would find a way to escape if she didn't finish him. "I'm not done with you, Kovalchuk," she growled, her voice cutting through the cold desert air. With a sudden, explosive movement, Kovalchuk lunged, knocking the gun from Sarah's hand. They tumbled to the ground, struggling against one another in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. He was strong, his movements calculated, but Sarah had one advantage. She had nothing left to lose. With a swift knee to his stomach, she pushed Kovalchuk off of her, scrambling to regain her footing. He was already back on his feet, a menacing glint in his eyes as he reached for another weapon. But before he could draw it, Sarah was upon him again. In one swift motion, she delivered a brutal punch to his jaw, sending him reeling. She grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back and slamming him to the ground. "This is over, Kovalchuk," she hissed, her voice filled with finality. Kovalchuk's grin flickered for just a moment, replaced by a flash of something darker. He wasn't beaten yet. The man had more fight in him than she had anticipated. But before he could react, a shot rang out from behind them, the sound of a bullet piercing the air. Kovalchuk's eyes widened as the bullet found its target. His own men, the ones he had trusted, had turned on him. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Kovalchuk crumpled to the ground, the shock of betrayal evident on his face. Ben stepped forward from the shadows, his weapon raised, eyes narrowed. "I told you it wasn't over yet," he said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of something personal. "I've been waiting for this moment." Kovalchuk let out a labored laugh, blood pooling around him. You think you've won?" he spat, but his voice was growing weaker. "You can't stop this. The network is bigger than you know. You'll never know who's really in charge." Sarah looked down at the man who had caused so much pain, so much death. His words felt empty now. His empire was crumbling, and he knew it. The weight of his final moments hung in the air, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. "Who's really in charge, Kovalchuk?" she asked, her voice steady as she bent down to look into his eyes, the last flicker of defiance still present. But Kovalchuk didn't respond. His eyes glazed over, and his body went limp. The fight was over. Sarah has finally defeated Kovalchuk, but there's a mystery left behind. What do you think Kovalchuk meant by his last words? Who is the real power behind his empire? What's next for Sarah and Ben now that the mission is complete? Share your theories and predictions in the comments. The stillness of the desert night pressed in around them, the only sound the distant hum of the wind as it swept over the broken compound. Sarah stood over Kovalchuk's lifeless body, her breath slow and measured, as though she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. The danger was gone. The immediate threat had been eliminated. But the unease didn't lift. It lingered, gnawing at her insides. Ben approached from behind, his steps cautious. He had a grim look on his face, eyes scanning their surroundings. Despite the victory, Sarah could tell that his mind was already working through the aftermath, just like hers. Is it really over? Ben asked quietly, his voice tinged with doubt. Sarah exhaled, her gaze shifting from Kovalchuk's body to the horizon. She didn't have an answer. Kovalchuk's empire had crumbled, but the final words he had spoken before dying still echoed in her ears. You'll never know who's really in charge. Kovalchuk had been a mastermind, a puppet master pulling the strings of a network that reached further than they could have imagined. But his words suggested that he was just one piece in a much larger puzzle. And now, Sarah was left to wonder who else was involved. Who else was watching, waiting, pulling strings from the shadows? I don't know, Sarah replied, her voice quiet but firm. But I'm not going to stop until I find out. Ben's eyes flickered with concern, but he didn't argue. Instead, he glanced over at Steele, who was still sitting in the truck, eyes wide, taking in everything that had just unfolded. His presence was a reminder of the complexity of the situation. Steele was both the cause of their escape and the key to the information they needed. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that his involvement in this mission was far from over. We need to move, Sarah said, her tone decisive. Kovalchuk's people will be here soon, and whatever he was trying to protect, we need to get our hands on it before it disappears. Ben nodded, and they moved quickly to the truck. The tires kicked up dust as they drove away, the compound shrinking in the rearview mirror. But despite the physical distance between them and the danger, Sarah's mind raced. What had Kovalchuk meant? Who was in charge? And how deep did the conspiracy run? The drive was long, but the miles stretched on in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The cold desert night seemed to swallow the truck, its headlights casting a narrow path ahead. The shadows of the mountains loomed like silent sentinels as they moved further away from the compound. Ben's eyes never left the road, but he was clearly aware of Sarah's unease. You're still thinking about Kovalchuk's last words, aren't you? Sarah didn't respond immediately. The words had dug into her, like a splinter that couldn't be removed. She had to know who was behind Kovalchuk. Who had he been working for? And why had he been so confident that his network was invincible? I'm just trying to piece it together, Sarah finally replied, her voice distant. We've seen this before. The system. The people at the top, there's always someone else pulling the strings. Ben glanced over at her, his jaw tightening. I get it, but you've already done more than anyone else could. Kovalchuk is dead. We've taken him down. That's more than most people could ever dream of. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She couldn't be. They were too close now, too deep in the heart of something far bigger than they had initially thought. We'll see, Sarah said, her voice hardening with determination. We need to follow the trail, wherever it leads. The truck rumbled on through the night, the road ahead uncertain. Sarah glanced over at Steele, who was staring blankly ahead, lost in his own thoughts. He had been through so much, and yet, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was hiding something important. Steele, Sarah said, her tone sharp, pulling him out of his reverie. We need to talk. He blinked, his expression hardening as he met her gaze. What about? We need to know everything you know about Kovalchuk's operations, Sarah said. I don't trust that his death ends things. And I'm sure you don't either. Steele shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away. I've told you everything I know, he said, his voice tense. Kovalchuk was a dangerous man, but he wasn't the only one. There are others who were working with him, people who are still out there. I only know bits and pieces, but I'll give you what I can. Sarah narrowed her eyes, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. And those bits and pieces are enough to put a stop to it all, right? Enough to bring down the rest of the network? Steele hesitated, then nodded slowly. I think so, but I need your help too. I was just a cog in the machine. I never had the full picture. Sarah considered his words carefully. She wanted to believe him, but the doubt lingered. She didn't know if she could trust Steele completely, not after everything that had happened. But there was no turning back now. If you have any information that can help us, now's the time to share it, she said, her voice firm. He nodded again, his expression grave. There's a ledger, a list of names, contacts, operations. It's in a safe house. Kovalchuk kept it hidden, but I know where it is. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough they needed, the key to unraveling the rest of the conspiracy. Where? She asked, her voice sharp. Steele looked out the window, his face distant. It's in an old warehouse on the outskirts of L.A. You'll need to act fast. The moment Kovalchuk's people realize he's dead, they'll be hunting for it. The next step is clear, the ledger. But can Sarah and Ben trust Steele completely? Is he hiding more than he's letting on? What other secrets does he know that could change everything? Share your theories and predictions below. What's really at stake now that Kovalchuk is dead? The city lights of Los Angeles loomed in the distance, a stark contrast to the desolate desert they had just left behind. The hustle and bustle of the city seemed like a world away from the chaos that had unfolded only hours ago. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she stared out the truck's window, her thoughts still on Kovalchuk, the dangerous words he'd left behind, and the cryptic information Steele had just given them. A ledger, a list of names, operations, and secrets. Everything they needed to take down the remaining parts of Kovalchuk's network. If Steele was telling the truth, this could be the key to finally ending the nightmare. But there was no time to waste. The moment Kovalchuk's death was discovered, his people would be scrambling to recover any valuable intel, and that included the ledger. Sarah knew that getting to it first was critical, but even with the urgency of the situation, the uneasy feeling in her gut wouldn't let up. Something wasn't right. Steele's reluctance to talk fully, his guarded answers, they bothered her more than she wanted to admit. But she had no choice. The mission had to come first. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of L.A., hidden in the industrial district. It wasn't a place where most people would think to look for anything valuable. But Sarah knew better. The most dangerous secrets were often tucked away in places no one would expect. The warehouse stood in eerie silence, tucked between a row of abandoned buildings. A flickering streetlight cast long shadows across the cracked pavement. Ben slowed the truck, bringing it to a halt in the shadows just a few yards away from the entrance. Sarah could feel the tension building in her chest. They were close. They had no idea what they were about to walk into, but one thing was certain. They weren't alone. Stay sharp, Sarah ordered as she grabbed her gear and slid out of the truck, her boots hitting the pavement with a quiet thud. Ben was right behind her, his expression grim. Steele, though, lingered behind, looking uneasy. Are you sure this is the right place? Ben asked, his voice low as he surveyed the surroundings. I'm sure, Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the warehouse for any signs of movement. If Steele is right, the ledger's inside. Steele's gaze flickered nervously as he shifted from foot to foot. It's in the back, hidden in a safe. I don't know if anyone's here, but we can't be too careful. We'll handle it, Sarah said, her voice firm. She motioned for Ben to follow her as she moved toward the back of the warehouse, her senses heightened. Every crack in the pavement, every shift in the air seemed amplified in the quiet night. They crept closer to the entrance, moving in sync. Sarah's hand hovered near her weapon, ready for whatever waited inside. They'd faced danger before, but this felt different. The closer they got, the more she could sense something lurking in the shadows. They reached the door. It was old, rusted, and barely hanging on its hinges. Sarah pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sound that might indicate movement on the other side. A faint noise, like something scraping against metal, reached her ears. She motioned for Ben to step back as she slowly pushed the door open, just enough to peer inside. The dim light inside revealed a cluttered interior, boxes, crates, and discarded furniture strewn about haphazardly. But the safe was in the far corner, just as Steele had described. It was a large, steel vault, old but still solid. Sarah's heart raced as she slipped into the warehouse, Ben right behind her. "Stay quiet," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she moved toward the safe. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. They had to get the ledger, and they had to get out before things went wrong. But as they reached the safe, something shifted. A creaking sound echoed through the warehouse, and Sarah's instinct screamed that they were not alone. She turned to face Ben, only to find him frozen, staring at the far corner of the room. "Ben?" Sarah whispered urgently, but before she could move, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot rang out. Everything happened in a blur. Sarah dove to the ground instinctively, just as the bullet whizzed past her head. She heard Ben's shout of pain, but she didn't have time to look. She had to move, had to stay focused. The warehouse was no longer a safe haven. It was a battlefield. "Ben," Sarah called, her heart racing. She could hear him groaning in pain behind her, but there was no time to check on him. She had to stop the shooter first. From the shadows, figures emerged. Two men, their faces obscured by masks, were taking cover behind crates. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her gun, but she knew it would be useless if she didn't get closer. She darted behind a stack of crates, using the distraction to her advantage. "Steele," Sarah shouted. "Where the hell are you?" Steele was nowhere to be seen. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Steele had led them into a trap. She cursed under her breath, moving quickly and silently toward the shooters. The men weren't expecting her to come from behind them, and Sarah made her move. She launched herself forward, taking one of the men down with a swift blow to the neck. The other man spun around, but it was too late. Sarah was already on him, pinning him to the ground with a vice-like grip. "Where's Steele?" she demanded, her voice cold. The man struggled, but he was no match for Sarah's strength. He gasped, He's gone. Left us here to die." A sick feeling settled in Sarah's stomach. Steele had betrayed them. Not only had he led them into an ambush, but now he was gone, vanishing into the shadows. Before Sarah could process everything, Ben staggered to his feet, clutching his side. Blood stained his shirt, but his eyes were still sharp with focus. "We need to finish this," he said, his voice strained but resolute. Sarah nodded. Steele had betrayed them, but they still had a job to do. They had to get the ledger, no matter what. Steele has betrayed Sarah and Ben, leaving them to fight for their lives in a dangerous warehouse. What do you think his motives were? Was it personal, or is there a bigger conspiracy at play? Can Sarah and Ben trust anyone else, or will they have to go rogue to finish this mission? Share your thoughts and theories below. The warehouse was a chaotic mess now. The deafening silence of a few moments ago had given way to the harsh sound of footsteps, quick and deliberate. Sarah moved fast, pulling Ben behind a stack of crates as she scanned the room for any signs of movement. The gunshot had alerted anyone within range, and she could feel the heavy pressure of time pushing down on her. Ben was hurt. He was trying to mask the pain, but Sarah could see the blood staining his side. "We need to move," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Get to the back. I'll cover you." Ben shook his head, wincing. "No, I'm not letting you go alone." "Ben, you're hurt," Sarah shot back, her voice firm. "Stay low and stay behind me. I'm not going to lose you over this." She could see the battle in his eyes, the stubbornness that had kept him alive for this long. He wasn't about to let her fight this alone, no matter the cost. But Sarah knew the stakes. They couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. "Just keep moving," she ordered, as she motioned for him to follow her. They moved swiftly, crouching low behind the crates and staying out of the line of sight. But Sarah knew they weren't alone. She could feel the eyes of someone watching them. Her instinct screamed that this wasn't just about the ledger anymore. It was about something far deeper. As they approached the back of the warehouse, Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that Steele's betrayal wasn't just about saving his own skin. No, this felt planned, calculated. He had been too involved in their operations for it to be a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had known where they were going, what they were after, and how to use them to get exactly what he wanted. The thought hit her like a cold wave. He'd been playing them from the start. But why? And what did he stand to gain by leading them into a trap? The ledger. It was the key. Kovalchuk's empire, whatever had been left behind after his death, was still out there, and Steele knew it was valuable, perhaps more than they had realized. The door to the back office of the warehouse loomed ahead, slightly ajar. Sarah's heart raced. This was it. If Steele's information was correct, the ledger should be inside. She motioned for Ben to stay behind her as she pushed the door open, keeping her body close to the frame to avoid detection. Her eyes darted around the small, dimly lit room. There it was, an old metal safe in the far corner. But just as she stepped forward, she froze. A soft creak echoed through the room. Someone was inside. Someone had been waiting for them. She could see a figure in the shadows, a tall, broad shape standing at the far end of the room, just beyond the safe. The figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face. "Steele!" Sarah hissed under her breath, her hand tightening around the grip of her weapon. I knew it. The betrayal had come full circle. Steele had been playing both sides, and now he was standing in front of them, blocking the only way to the ledger. Steele's expression was calm, almost eerily so, as he slowly raised his hands in mock surrender. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" he asked, his voice cool, betraying no emotion. "Steele, you sold us out," Ben spat, his voice strained with anger and pain. "What the hell is going on?" "Sold you out?" Steele chuckled softly, the sound dark and hollow. "No, Ben, you're not the ones who were played. I was. All this time, you thought I was helping you. But I was simply the pawn in a much bigger game." Sarah's heart sank. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the truth felt worse than she'd imagined. "Who's behind all of this?" she demanded. "Who's pulling the strings?" Steele's eyes flickered briefly, but he didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device, a remote. With a flick of his thumb, a loud mechanical whirring sound echoed from the back of the room. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what he had done. A trap. The safe, the ledger, they were just a distraction. The real target was something else entirely. Steele had triggered something inside the walls of the warehouse. Something that had been waiting. "Why the hell would you do this?" Ben growled, his anger barely contained as he staggered forward, his injury slowing him down. Steele didn't flinch. "Because, Ben, Kovalchuk was only the beginning. You think you've taken down the top dog? Think again. The network is much bigger than you realize. And now, you're both in the middle of something you can't stop." The whirring sound grew louder, and suddenly, the walls began to tremble. Sarah's eyes darted around in panic. There was no time left. She had to act. "We're getting out of here," Sarah said, her voice sharp with authority. She grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him toward the door. But before they could take another step, Steele's voice cut through the air one last time. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice laced with finality. "You've already lost." The explosion came seconds later. The entire warehouse seemed to collapse in on itself, the deafening blast sending shockwaves through the ground. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring their vision as Sarah pushed Ben forward, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no time to think. They had to move. "Now, go," Sarah shouted, shoving Ben ahead of her as the building around them groaned and cracked under the weight of the explosion. The fire was spreading quickly, and they had no choice but to run for their lives. They sprinted out of the building, adrenaline fueling their every step. The heat from the flames licked at their backs, but they kept running, blind to anything but the need to escape. As they reached the truck, Sarah looked back at the burning wreckage of the warehouse, her mind reeling. Steele had been more than just a traitor. He had set them up, and now they had nothing. No ledger. No answers. Only more questions. Where the hell do we go from here? Ben asked, his voice strained as he slumped against the truck. Sarah didn't have an answer. The world had just shifted beneath her feet, and she knew one thing for sure. The battle was far from over. Steele's betrayal has led to a devastating explosion and the loss of everything they fought for. What do you think Steele's real motives are? Who is he working for? And what's the next step for Sarah and Ben? Is there anyone they can trust now? Share your thoughts on where the story might go from here. The truck lurched to life as Sarah slammed her foot on the accelerator, the engine growling as they sped away from the burning wreckage of the warehouse. Ben, now seated beside her, was still clutching his side, but his gaze was fixed ahead, his mind clearly elsewhere. The explosion had been deafening, and the flames had already consumed the entire structure. Sarah could feel the heat on her back as they tore through the deserted industrial streets, but the fire wasn't the real threat anymore. It was Steele, and whatever game he was playing, they were in the middle of it. "Where are we going?" Ben asked, his voice rough from the pain. Sarah's grip tightened on the wheel as she glanced at him. He was pale, sweating, and his hand was still pressed against his wound. But despite his obvious discomfort, his eyes were sharp, focused. There was no way she was leaving him behind, not after everything they'd been through together. "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted, her voice tight. "But Steele's gone, and we need answers. We can't trust anyone right now. We're on our own." Ben nodded but said nothing. He understood better than anyone the weight of her words. Trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford. As they left the industrial district behind, Sarah's mind was racing. Steele had been the key to finding the ledger, to putting an end to Kovalchuk's network. But now, they were back to square one. The explosion had wiped out any trace of the ledger, and Steele had vanished into the shadows. Whoever he was working for had to be bigger, more dangerous than they realized. They were dealing with something far beyond Kovalchuk now. They drove through the night, making their way out of Los Angeles, heading towards the outskirts of the city. Sarah's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting someone to be tailing them. The feeling of being hunted never left her. The explosion wasn't just a warning, it was a message. Steele had set them up, but why? And who had he betrayed them to? Ben shifted in his seat, groaning in pain as he adjusted his grip on his side. He was clearly trying to remain strong, but Sarah could see the blood soaking through his shirt. She needed to find a place to patch him up, but her mind kept going back to Steele and the larger conspiracy they were entangled in. They couldn't stop. Not yet. She pulled off the main highway, heading toward a small, secluded motel on the edge of town. She parked in the lot, her headlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The place looked run down, but it would do for now. "Stay here," Sarah ordered as she cut the engine and climbed out of the truck. Ben didn't argue. He was too exhausted. She walked into the motel's office, her eyes scanning the room for anything suspicious. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up, too focused on the screen in front of him to notice her. "I need a room for the night," Sarah said, her voice calm, though her mind was still racing. The clerk nodded absent-mindedly and handed her a key without a second glance. She paid him in cash, then returned to the truck, where Ben was still sitting, looking out the window. "We're staying here for the night. I'll patch you up, then we figure out what's next," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. Ben just nodded, though she could see the fatigue written all over his face. He didn't have the strength to argue. They both needed rest, but sleep would be a luxury they couldn't afford. Inside the room, Sarah quickly locked the door and set to work, searching the small bathroom for any medical supplies. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the flickering light overhead did little to ease the tension in the air. She found a small first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet and returned to Ben's side. "Let me see," she said softly, kneeling in front of him as he reluctantly lifted his shirt. The wound on his side was bad. It looked like it had been a shallow bullet graze, but it was still deep enough to need attention. Blood had soaked through his shirt, and Sarah knew they didn't have much time before the wound became infected. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she pulled out antiseptic and cleaned the wound carefully. Ben winced, but he didn't make a sound. As she worked, her mind wandered back to the explosion, to Steele's cryptic words. The game was far from over. They were just getting started, and now, They were in the crosshairs of an even bigger threat. The question was, who? Sarah. Ben's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to find him watching her with a weary gaze. What are we dealing with here? This, Steele's betrayal, none of it makes sense. I know, she said softly, as she finished cleaning the wound and began to bandage it. I thought I could trust him. We both did. But now, it's clear that he was working for someone else all along. Whoever they are, they're playing a much bigger game than Kovalchuk's empire. Ben sighed, closing his eyes as Sarah finished up the bandage. We need to get back in the game. We can't just sit here. We've got too much at stake now. Sarah's eyes narrowed. I'm not resting until I get answers. But first, we need to figure out how to find Steele. And if we can't, we go after the people behind him. Ben nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. He was still hurt, but Sarah could see the fire inside him burning brighter than ever. They were going to finish this, one way or another. It was nearly dawn when Sarah's phone buzzed, shattering the silence of the room. She froze, staring at the screen. Unknown number. Her instincts kicked in, and she picked up the phone cautiously. Sarah. A familiar voice came through the line, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Steele. You've got a lot of explaining to do, Sarah said, her voice cold as steel. Steele chuckled, but there was a hint of tension in his voice. I never thought you'd catch on this quickly, Sarah, but you're not wrong. The game's bigger than you think, and you've just scratched the surface. Where are you? Sarah demanded. You owe me answers. Steele's tone shifted, his voice lower now. I can give you answers, but it's going to cost you. I'm not the enemy here. If you want the truth, come alone. You've got 24 hours. The line went dead before Sarah could respond. Steele's cryptic call has left Sarah and Ben with more questions than answers. Why is Steele offering them the truth? What does he stand to gain by revealing the bigger conspiracy? And should they trust him? Or is this yet another trap? What should Sarah and Ben do next? Share your thoughts and theories below. The room fell silent again after the call ended. Sarah sat still, her hand gripping the phone as if it might slip away if she loosened her hold. Ben, still recovering from his wound, watched her closely, his face weary but expectant. 24 hours, Sarah muttered, half to herself. He thinks this is a game. Ben leaned back in his chair, grimacing at the pain in his side. He's not wrong. We're running out of time. But if he's offering answers, we have to take that chance. We need to know what we're dealing with here. Sarah let out a breath, shaking her head. She didn't want to trust Steele, couldn't trust him, but at the same time, there was something about his tone, something in the way he spoke, that made her second-guess everything she knew. He's playing us, she finally said, her voice hard with resolve. But he's also scared. Whatever's behind this is bigger than anything we thought. And we're not going to find out what it is sitting here waiting. Ben nodded, wincing. You're right. So, what's the play? The plan was simple. Meet Steele, but stay cautious. Sarah knew better than to trust him completely, but right now, they had little choice. If Steele had real information, it could be their only lead. They needed to find him, fast, and make sure they didn't fall into another trap. They packed up quickly, keeping their movements sharp and deliberate. Sarah made sure Ben had everything he needed. Extra bandages, water, and a small med kit in case the wound worsened. She could see the pain etched in his face, but he wasn't complaining. He had bigger things on his mind. The game was still on, and they were both players in a much larger scheme. As they left the motel, Sarah's mind kept racing. If Steele really was offering the truth, what kind of truth would it be? She had her doubts. Everything about this situation felt wrong. But without more information, they had no choice but to follow the lead. Steele had told them to come alone, and they knew better than to show up with backup. This was personal. It had to be. The stakes were higher now, and if there was any chance of pulling the curtain back on the larger conspiracy, they had to take it. They arrived at the designated location, a rundown warehouse near the docks, not far from where the explosion had happened. Sarah's instincts were on high alert as they approached, her eyes scanning every corner. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Ben and Sarah stepped out of the truck, each moving with caution. They weren't exactly in enemy territory yet, but this could quickly turn into a trap. "Stay close," Sarah whispered to Ben. He gave her a small nod, his eyes narrowing as they approached the warehouse door. When they reached the entrance, Sarah's hand hovered over her gun. She wasn't ready to trust Steele, and she wasn't going to be caught off guard. She pushed the door open with a slow, controlled motion. The space inside was dark, only the dim glow of overhead lights illuminating the edges. Steele's silhouette stood near the back, leaning against a stack of crates, waiting for them. "Sarah." "Ben." Steele greeted them with a casual nod, his voice almost mocking. He seemed different now. His previous confidence had given way to something more guarded, more desperate. "You've got one shot at explaining yourself," Sarah said, her tone sharp as she stood her ground. "I'm done playing games." Steele held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not here to play games, Sarah. I'm here to give you answers. The truth you're both so eager to uncover." Ben stepped forward, his body stiff with pain but his eyes burning with anger. "Start talking. What the hell are we dealing with?" Steele looked between them, weighing his options. He was calculating, the way a chess player considers every move before taking the next. What you're dealing with is much bigger than Kovalchuk's empire. It's an international operation, one that's been running under your noses for years. Kovalchuk was a pawn in a much larger game. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to steady her breathing. Steele's eyes darkened. "I worked for someone more powerful than Kovalchuk, and they're coming for you both." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "It's not just about money or power. It's about control. The ledger? It wasn't just Kovalchuk's legacy. It's a blueprint for the entire operation. If you had it, you'd have the key to something much more dangerous than you can even imagine." "Who's pulling the strings?" Ben demanded, his voice low but furious. "Who are you really working for?" Steele hesitated. For a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes. Guilt, fear, or maybe just resignation. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He wasn't ready to name names. Not yet. "I can't say much more than that right now," Steele said, his voice strained. "But I can tell you one thing. They know you're here. And they're already on their way." The air in the warehouse grew tense as Sarah processed Steele's words. This was no longer just about Kovalchuk's empire. Whoever had been pulling the strings had been operating in the shadows, and they had just painted a huge target on her and Ben's backs. "They?" Sarah echoed, her mind racing. "Who the hell are they?" Before Steele could answer, a sharp noise broke the silence, a vehicle's engine approaching fast. It wasn't just one car. There were multiple vehicles, and they were closing in fast. Steele's face darkened. "We don't have much time." Ben's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his side. "We need to get out of here. Now." Sarah grabbed Steele's arm. "I don't trust you, but you're coming with us. If we're going to get out of here alive, we need all the information we can get." Steele didn't resist. "Fine, but you need to understand, they'll be on us within minutes. There's no time for games." They ran for the back exit, but as they reached the door, they were greeted by a wall of gunmen. Steele cursed under his breath, raising his hands in surrender, but Sarah and Ben were already on edge, prepared for a fight. The truth has started to unravel, but new threats are closing in on Sarah, Ben, and Steele. What do you think Steele's real motives are? Who is they? And why do they want Sarah and Ben dead? How should Sarah and Ben handle this next chapter in their dangerous journey? Share your thoughts and theories. The situation escalated within seconds. Sarah's mind raced as she scanned the dark warehouse, trying to calculate their options. The gunmen blocking the exit weren't here for a chat. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a fight for survival. Steele's body was stiff beside her, his hands raised in surrender. Ben, however, had already pulled his weapon, his face set in grim determination. He wasn't going down without a fight. Sarah's fingers twitched near her own gun, but she held back. She needed to think. She wasn't about to get caught in the middle of a firefight, especially with Steele, who was just as likely to sell them out as he was to help them. She needed answers, and she needed them now. "Steele," she hissed under her breath, keeping her voice low. "I thought you said you were on our side." He didn't look at her, his eyes locked on the armed men advancing toward them. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Steele muttered, his voice strained. "But it's not going to be easy." Ben took a step forward, raising his gun, but Sarah stopped him with a sharp gesture. There had to be another way out of this. The gunmen didn't hesitate. One of them, a tall figure with a black mask, barked an order. "Drop your weapons. Now." The words were as much of a command as they were a warning. The cold, calculated tone sent a chill down Sarah's spine. These were professionals. The kind that didn't hesitate. "We don't have time for this," Sarah snapped, her eyes flicking around the room. There had to be another exit, another way to turn the tables. "Get in the truck," one of the gunmen shouted. Before Sarah could react, there was a loud crashing noise from the back of the warehouse. The sound of tires screeching and doors slamming echoed through the concrete walls. It was too late to think, too late to strategize. A new vehicle had arrived, and it was barreling straight toward them. The vehicle that burst through the warehouse's entrance was a black SUV, sleek and fast. The doors flew open, and two more heavily armed men emerged. They were dressed in tactical gear, moving with purpose and precision. But it wasn't just their weapons that caught Sarah's attention. It was their leader. A woman, tall and imposing, stepped out of the vehicle, her icy gaze scanning the room like a predator hunting its prey. Her sharp features were set in a mask of determination, and her posture radiated confidence. "Sarah Monroe." The woman's voice rang out across the room, chilling and authoritative. "You've made quite a mess of things." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. "Agent Keegan?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to draw the woman's attention. Agent Keegan, formerly one of the best in her field, a government operative who had disappeared without a trace years ago. Sarah had heard rumors that Keegan had gone rogue, but to see her standing here, armed and in charge of a small army, was something else entirely. "You," Sarah said, her voice now a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You're the one pulling the strings, aren't you?" Keegan's lips curled into a cold smile. "I'm not the villain here, Sarah. You and your friend are in way over your heads. And now, it's time to clean up your mess." Ben's grip tightened around his gun. He was clearly no fan of Keegan, and neither was Sarah. They'd always trusted the government, until now. Keegan was a ghost, a phantom who had left them all questioning the very systems they thought they could rely on. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah demanded, her anger rising. "What is all this? The explosions, the betrayals, the lies?" Keegan's eyes flashed with something darker, something almost pitying. "It's bigger than you, Sarah, and bigger than Kovalchuk. You think this is just about money and power? No, it's about control. Control of an entire operation that spans across borders. And it's about to change the world as you know it." Sarah felt the weight of her words. Keegan wasn't just some rogue agent. She was part of something far darker, something global. "You still don't get it, do you?" Keegan continued, taking a step closer. "You and Steele were never meant to get the ledger. The operation has always been bigger than the ledger. But now, I think it's time you understand just how deep this runs." The tension in the room was palpable. Every movement felt like a potential trigger for the firefight that was sure to follow. Sarah's mind was spinning. Steele, Keegan. This wasn't just a case of betrayal anymore. There were forces at work, forces beyond her understanding, and they had only scratched the surface. "Enough talk," Ben growled. He moved into position, prepared for whatever was coming next. Keegan raised a hand, stopping the men in their tracks. "Don't be so hasty. I think it's time you two learn the truth about what's really at stake here." She turned her gaze back to Steele. "You've been a problem for far too long. I'm done playing nice. It's time for you to finish what you started, or be dealt with." Steele tensed, his eyes darting between Keegan and the men surrounding them. It was clear he didn't want to end up on the wrong side of the people who controlled the operation. "You want me to finish it?" Steele said, his voice a mix of defiance and fear. "You're not getting away with this. I'm not your pawn anymore." Keegan smiled, almost as if amused by his words. "You were never my pawn, Steele. You were just too useful to eliminate. Now, you've become a liability. And liabilities get cleaned up." Sarah didn't know what to do. The room was closing in around them, and she could feel the weight of the guns trained on them. But one thing was clear. The odds were stacked against them. Keegan's operation had everything under control. Then, something in her clicked. There was one chance, one way out, but it was risky. They had to move fast. "Ben, go for the exit," she shouted. Ben didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted toward the back of the warehouse, hoping to lose their pursuers in the maze of corridors. Sarah quickly followed, grabbing Steele by the arm. "You're coming with me," she growled, dragging him along. The gunman moved to block the exit, but Keegan's voice stopped them. "Let them go," she ordered, her voice laced with cold authority. "Why?" one of the men asked, confused. "Because we need them alive," Keegan answered, her gaze still on Sarah and Ben as they disappeared into the shadows. "And I need Sarah Monroe." Sarah and Ben have made a break for it, but Agent Keegan's involvement complicates things further. What is Keegan's ultimate goal, and what role does Steele play in all of this? Do you think they can escape Keegan's grip, or will they be caught in her web? What should they do next? Share your thoughts and predictions in the comments. The sound of boots pounding on the concrete floor echoed behind Sarah and Ben as they sprinted through the dark maze of the warehouse. Every breath felt heavier, more labored, as they pushed forward, the adrenaline fueling their movements. "Keep going," Sarah yelled, her voice hoarse. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the presence of the men chasing them. They had a head start, but not for long. Ben, grimacing from the pain in his side, pushed through despite his injury. His jaw was clenched in determination. He wasn't going to slow down, not now. "Where are we going?" he gasped, glancing at Sarah as they rounded a corner. "We need to get to the docks. There's a boat. Backup should be there." Sarah wasn't sure if she was convincing him or herself, but they had no other options. They had to get out of this warehouse and fast. The corridor ahead split into two, but they knew they had to keep moving. The sound of their pursuers grew louder, closing in fast. It was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. Ben was the first to spot the door at the end of the hallway, a large, steel exit door, barely visible in the dim lighting. Without a word, he bolted for it, forcing the door open with all his remaining strength. It slammed against the wall, revealing the back alleyway outside. The air was cold, but the relief of being outside was short-lived. A vehicle engine roared to life in the distance. The gunmen were following them, fast. "We have to move," Sarah urged, grabbing Ben's arm. He winced but didn't protest as they sprinted into the shadows. The docks were just up ahead, but Sarah could feel the pressure mounting. They were being hunted now. There was no doubt about it. Keegan and her crew weren't just going to let them slip away. "Where's the boat?" Ben asked, his voice tense. "Straight ahead. Just keep moving." They reached the docks, their destination in sight, but the sight that greeted them was not what Sarah expected. The boat they were heading for, a small, discreet speedboat that had been arranged for an escape, was gone. The docks were eerily silent, save for the faint sound of waves crashing against the wooden posts. "Shit," Sarah muttered, her heart sinking. "The boat's gone." "Who the hell took it?" Ben snapped, glancing over his shoulder. "We can't just stand here. We'll be sitting ducks." Sarah's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. Who had taken the boat? Had someone tipped off Keegan? The entire operation felt like it was falling apart in real time. "Ben, we have to get to another exit." "There's no time to waste," Sarah said, her voice firm. But even as she spoke, she knew they were running out of options. Their escape route had been cut off, and they were on the verge of being cornered. The sound of the approaching vehicles echoed in the distance. It wouldn't be long before Keegan's men arrived at the docks. Sarah knew they couldn't afford another delay. But then, just as the panic began to rise, she saw something else. A flicker of movement from the shadows near the edge of the docks. Someone was watching them. She squinted, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the moonlight. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and familiar. "Steele?" Sarah called, her voice tinged with disbelief. What was he doing here? He didn't respond right away, but Sarah could tell from the look in his eyes that he wasn't here to harm them. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "They know where you are," Steele said, his voice low. But I can get you out of here. How? Ben asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. He was still cautious, and Sarah didn't blame him. Steele had a history of being just as much of a threat as an ally. Steele didn't hesitate. There's a truck at the far end of the dock. It's yours if you want it, but you need to move. Now. Without waiting for further explanation, Sarah grabbed Ben's arm, and they followed Steele toward the end of the dock. Their footsteps were hurried, the sense of urgency overwhelming. They could hear the vehicles getting closer now, the sound of tires skimming the wet pavement growing louder. I don't trust you, Sarah said, her voice tense but low enough so only Steele could hear. But right now, I don't have a choice. Why are you helping us? Steele's eyes flashed with something Sarah couldn't quite read. It's complicated, he said, his voice clipped. But I owe you. More than you know. Ben, his suspicion still evident, shot Steele a glance but said nothing. They reached the truck, an old, nondescript vehicle parked at the edge of the dock. Sarah quickly climbed into the passenger seat, Ben following behind her. Steele jumped into the driver's seat, and without hesitation, the engine roared to life. We'll be safe for a while, but we have to keep moving, Steele said, slamming the gearshift into drive. The truck lurched forward, tires squealing as they sped out of the dock area. As the truck sped down the road, Sarah's mind was still racing. Steele had just saved their lives, but it didn't change the fact that they were still deep in a web of deceit, and they had no idea who was on the other end pulling the strings. Keegan had revealed nothing except more questions. Who was she really working for? What did she want with the ledger, and why had she come after them so relentlessly? Where are we going? Ben asked, his voice low. Steele glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Somewhere safe. For now. Safe? You just handed us a truck and a one-way ticket to nowhere, Sarah snapped. What's really going on, Steele? Who's after us? Steele's eyes grew dark, and for the first time, Sarah saw the vulnerability in his expression. You're in this deeper than you realize. This isn't just about the ledger anymore. It's about something much bigger, and they won't stop until they have it. Until they have you. The chase has intensified, and they've made an unexpected ally in Steele. But can Sarah and Ben trust him? Or is this just another dangerous twist in their journey? What do you think Steele's true motives are, and how should they handle the new information about their enemies? Share your thoughts in the comments. The truck raced through the night, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. The rhythmic thrum of the engine was the only sound that filled the air, and even that felt like it was suffocating under the weight of unanswered questions. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her thoughts a blur. They had barely made it out of the docks, and yet, the danger was far from over. Keegan was relentless, and now it seemed like they were being pulled into something even darker than they could have imagined. Ben was quiet behind them, his gaze fixed on the road behind them. His muscles were still tight from the fight, and Sarah could sense his unease. Neither of them trusted Steele, but right now, they didn't have a choice. You didn't answer me, Sarah said, breaking the silence. What exactly are you involved in, Steele? What's really going on? Steele's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white against the steering column. You don't want to know, he muttered, his voice rough. Not yet. Too bad, Ben said from the back seat. We're in this together now. You owe us answers. Steele shot Ben a sharp glance through the rearview mirror. Fine, he said, his voice biting. But don't expect it to make sense. Hell, I don't even understand it all myself. Steele took a sharp turn onto a dirt road that wound through thick trees. The truck bounced over uneven ground, and Sarah gripped the armrest to keep from being thrown off balance. My involvement goes back a few years, Steele began, his voice distant, like he was talking to himself more than anyone else. It was supposed to be a simple job. Infiltrate, gather intel, get paid, and disappear. But somewhere along the way, I got too deep. Started working for people I shouldn't have. I thought I was just doing my job, but then I found out things I shouldn't have. They weren't just pulling strings, they were rewriting the game. Sarah's curiosity piqued. She knew Steele wasn't just a former soldier turned mercenary. He had connections, high-level ones. But what game was he talking about? Who are they? Sarah pressed, her voice firm despite the unease gnawing at her stomach. Steele's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, his expression unreadable. Let's just say the people I got involved with aren't exactly the good guys. Keegan's a part of a bigger operation, a global syndicate, and they've been pulling the strings for a long time. The ledger, Sarah? It's just the beginning. He paused, the words hanging in the air like a bomb ready to drop. Sarah could feel the tension building, every nerve in her body on edge. The syndicate doesn't just control money. They control governments, economies, and entire regions. What you're dealing with is a power play that goes far beyond anything you've ever seen. And they'll stop at nothing to keep their control. That's why Keegan is after the ledger. It's a key to something much bigger. If they get their hands on it, they'll have the power to reshape the world order. Sarah's mind raced, processing Steele's words. A global syndicate? Governments? Economies? This was far bigger than she had ever anticipated. But what was the ledger? And why had it fallen into her hands? What's so special about the ledger? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Steele's jaw tightened as he looked ahead at the road. It contains information. Information that could bring down the entire syndicate. Names, operations, accounts. Secrets that would destroy everything they've built. If the wrong people get their hands on it, it's a weapon. A game changer. Then why the hell did you take it in the first place? Ben demanded from the back seat, his voice tinged with frustration. You're telling us it's a weapon and yet you? I didn't know at first. Steele cut him off sharply. I wasn't in it for the ledger, okay? I was just doing a job. But once I found out what it contained, things got complicated. I had to make a choice, and I chose to survive. The truck bounced over another patch of rough terrain, and Sarah felt her stomach churn. Steele's story was starting to make more sense, but it also raised more questions than it answered. The power and control he was describing, it wasn't just about money or politics. It was about control of everything. So what now? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. What happens when we get to wherever you're taking us? Steele glanced at her, his eyes hard. Now, we get to the safe house. It's the only place we can hide for the time being. They'll be looking for us, and they won't stop until they find us. You both need to understand, Keegan's just one player in this game. But she's dangerous. And the people behind her, they'll do whatever it takes to win. Ben leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. So what are you asking of us? To trust you? After all this? Steele's lips twisted into a grim smile. I'm asking for survival. Trust me or not, but if we're going to stay alive, we need to work together. You want to stop Keegan and her people? Then we have to keep moving. They drove in silence for a few moments, the weight of Steele's words sinking in. The truck came to a sudden halt, jolting them both forward. The headlights flickered as they pulled up to a small cabin hidden deep in the woods, far away from prying eyes. It was isolated, exactly what they needed, but it also had an unsettling feel to it. Steele didn't say anything as he put the truck in park and killed the engine. He turned to Sarah and Ben, his eyes grim. This is where we're going to lay low for now. We can't stay here long, but it'll buy us time to figure out our next move. Sarah looked at the small, unassuming cabin. A safe house. But there was no such thing as a safe house when you were up against an operation this big. Every move felt like it was under surveillance. It was a waiting game, and she hated it. All right, she said, her voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at her insides. Let's get inside. The trio climbed out of the truck, each of them wary, each of them knowing that their survival depended on one thing now. Staying one step ahead of Keegan and the global syndicate she was part of. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Steele was letting on. How deep was he involved in all of this? And who could they trust when everyone seemed to have an agenda? As they entered the cabin, the door creaked shut behind them, and Sarah felt the weight of the unknown press against her chest. They were trapped, but they weren't alone. Steele has revealed the existence of a global syndicate with dangerous plans, and now Sarah and Ben are hiding in a remote safe house. But can they trust Steele, or is he playing a deeper game? What's next for our trio? Do you think they can survive the syndicate's pursuit? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. The cabin was small, but surprisingly well equipped. It had the bare essentials, furniture, a kitchen with the basics, and a small bathroom. But it was clear that the place had been designed for one purpose: hiding. There were no windows facing the road, and the door was reinforced, a sign that whoever had built this place had anticipated the need for secrecy. Sarah stood by the window, watching the darkness outside. She could hear the distant sounds of the forest, but the stillness felt unsettling. They were isolated here, and it was the perfect place to lay low. But it also felt like they were waiting for the inevitable. Keegan and her men wouldn't stop. They knew Sarah had the ledger now, and she was certain the global syndicate wasn't far behind. They would come for her. Ben paced around the cabin, clearly frustrated. His injuries had slowed him down, and the pain was written all over his face. Still, he pushed through, barely acknowledging it as he muttered to himself. "So what now, Steele?" he asked abruptly, breaking the silence. "We sit here and wait for them to come knocking?" Steele leaned against the wall near the door, arms folded, his face unreadable. "We wait, but we prepare. We need to gather intel, make sure we're not caught off guard. The last thing we need is to be blindsided." Sarah turned from the window and walked toward them. "How much longer until Keegan finds us?" she asked, her voice tight with impatience. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. There was no escaping it. Their every move was being watched. Steele's eyes were hard, as if he was calculating every possible outcome. "Not long. Keegan's not stupid. She'll be looking for us. But what she doesn't know is that she doesn't just need you. She needs the ledger. And that's where we have the advantage." For a moment, silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Ben, still irritated, slumped into a chair, rubbing his side where the bullet had grazed him. His eyes never left Steele, and Sarah could sense the distrust between them. Sarah took a step closer to Steele. "You said you owed us. I'm starting to wonder if you have your own agenda here. What exactly are you planning?" Steele's face didn't shift, but there was a flash of something. Regret? Guilt? That passed through his expression before he masked it. "You don't understand," he said softly. "I didn't just help you because I owe you. I helped because if I don't help you, they'll kill me too." Before Sarah could press further, the sound of an engine roaring in the distance froze her in her tracks. The truck had barely started to move when the engine cut out, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle rolling to a stop outside. It was too soon. They weren't ready. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she looked at Ben. The fear in his eyes mirrored hers. Their time had run out. Steele shot up from his position by the door, his hand reaching for his gun instinctively. "Stay quiet," he hissed. "Don't make a sound." They all ducked low, hearts pounding in their chests. The cabin wasn't fortified, not enough to withstand a direct assault, but it was their only chance. The noise outside grew louder. Footsteps crunching on the gravel, the sound of doors slamming, and then the unmistakable shout of a voice that Sarah knew all too well. "Check the back, the side." Keegan's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "They can't have gone far." Sarah's blood ran cold. Keegan was here, and it was only a matter of time before they were found. Steele moved quickly, his eyes sharp and focused as he scanned the room. "We don't have much time," he said urgently. "Ben, Sarah, grab what you can. We need to move now." "What about you?" Ben demanded, his voice low. Steele didn't hesitate. "I'll buy you time. Just go." "No way," Sarah snapped, her jaw tight with defiance. "We stick together. Now." Steele shouted, his voice hard. "You think they'll stop with just me? Go." Sarah hesitated, but Ben grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the back door. The tension in the air was palpable. She could hear the men approaching, their footsteps getting closer and closer. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, to fight back, but Steele's words echoed in her mind. He was right. They couldn't afford to be caught here. They burst out the back door, the night air cold against their skin. They sprinted across the yard, heading toward the tree line. Behind them, Steele's voice rang out in a desperate command. "Get out of here now." As they ducked into the shadows, Sarah glanced back one last time. Steele was already facing the cabin door, ready to make his stand. The sound of gunfire rang out, and Sarah flinched, her heart dropping into her stomach. "Keep moving," Ben urged, pulling her further into the trees. They ran for what felt like hours, the cold night air cutting into their lungs as they moved through the dense forest. Sarah didn't dare look back. She knew if they were caught, it would be over. Ben stumbled once, catching himself just in time. But they kept moving, driven by the need to survive. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, but they didn't stop. There was no time to rest, no time to breathe. "We need a plan," Ben gasped, his voice ragged. "We can't just keep running like this." Sarah nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow, even though the cold air was biting. "We get to the city. There's someone there who can help us, someone I trust." Ben shot her a skeptical look, but said nothing. He didn't have to. They both knew the odds were slim that anyone would be able to help them now, but it was the only option they had. They reached the edge of the forest after another grueling hour of running. Ahead of them was a small road that led to a neighboring town. They could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance, a symbol of civilization that felt miles away. For the first time since they left the cabin, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe. She turned to Ben. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, despite the tension still hanging between them. Ben nodded, though his face was still pale from the exertion and pain. "Yeah, but I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up." Sarah could see the fatigue in his eyes. But there was also something else, determination. Ben wasn't going to give up. Neither was she. "We'll make it through this," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. They didn't have the luxury of hope anymore. It was all about survival now. As they walked toward the road, Sarah's mind was racing with thoughts of Steele. He'd sacrificed himself to give them a chance. Had he made it out alive? Or had he been caught? Steele has made the ultimate sacrifice, buying Sarah and Ben time to escape, but will they make it to safety? And what's next for them now that the danger is closing in on all sides? Do you think Steele will be able to escape, or was this his final act of redemption? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon as Sarah and Ben reached the edge of the small town. They had spent the last few hours moving quickly but carefully, staying off the main roads and sticking to the shadows. Despite the weariness in their bones, the town's proximity gave them a sense of hope, something they hadn't felt in days. They paused at the edge of a dilapidated building, taking a moment to catch their breath. The streets were empty, the world still asleep, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't being hunted. "Where exactly are we going?" Ben asked, glancing at Sarah as she surveyed the area. His voice was quieter now, tinged with both exhaustion and something else, something that resembled doubt. Sarah looked up at him, her face set in a grim expression. "I know someone here, someone who can help us." Ben raised an eyebrow. "Someone who's still trustworthy after everything that's happened? After Steele? After Keegan?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hardening. "It's not about trust anymore. It's about survival. If we don't get help soon, they'll find us. And we don't have much time." Ben nodded, his skepticism still hanging in the air, but he didn't argue. They both knew the stakes. There was no going back now. They moved swiftly through the town, staying low and keeping to the alleys. Every creak of the old buildings, every distant car, made Sarah's heart race, her senses on high alert. They were so close, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they approached a small, inconspicuous building tucked away on a quiet street, Sarah's heart beat faster. This was it. The person inside could either be their salvation or their undoing. She knocked on the door, quick and sharp, the signal they had agreed on years ago. The door opened a crack, and a pair of cautious eyes peered out. "Sarah?" The voice on the other side was low, a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "Sam," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "We need your help. Now." The door opened wider, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man standing in the shadows. His face was rough with stubble, his eyes sharp despite the weariness in them. He had always been the type to stay out of the spotlight, keeping his head down even when things went sideways. "Ben, right?" Sam asked, his gaze flicking over to the man standing beside Sarah. Ben nodded curtly, but his attention was already on the door behind them. "We're not staying long," Sam took one last look down the street, making sure no one was following them before he stepped aside. "Come inside," he said, his voice low. "We don't have much time." Inside, the building was modest but clean. The faint smell of old books and oil filled the air, and Sarah could see the faint glow of a few monitors in the corner. Sam wasn't just a former contact. He was a well-placed individual in a network of information brokers. The kind of person who could make things disappear or make them reappear, depending on who you asked. "How did you find us?" Ben asked, looking around the small room. "We're not exactly being subtle." Sam didn't answer right away. He walked to the desk in the corner and flipped open a laptop, tapping away at the keys. A few seconds later, he turned the screen around to face them. "Because I've been tracking you," he said. "I knew something was off the moment I heard about Keegan. You don't deal with people like her without attracting attention." Sarah swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. "What do you know about her?" "Keegan's part of something bigger," Sam said, his voice grim. "A global operation. She's not working alone. She's working for someone who has people everywhere. You're not just dealing with a few thugs anymore. This is international, Sarah. They'll find you, no matter where you go." The words felt like a punch to the gut. They were deeper in this than they had ever imagined. "So what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he looked up at her. "I've got a safe house, but it's not in the city. You'll need to lay low for a while, until I can get more information. We're going to need leverage, and that ledger you have? That's your leverage. But it's going to take time to figure out how to use it." Ben's eyes narrowed. "How do we know we can trust you?" "You don't," Sam replied bluntly. "But I'm the only shot you've got right now." They spent the next few hours making plans, moving quickly, knowing they couldn't stay in one place for too long. Sam provided them with a few supplies, food, a change of clothes, some emergency cash, and gave them the location of a safe house far outside the city. It was their best chance of getting out of the line of fire. As they prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation. Every decision they made now carried the possibility of failure. The stakes were higher than ever. Ben caught her gaze as they stood in the doorway. "You trust him?" Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. "I trust that he's our only chance." She wasn't sure if that was enough to keep them alive, but it was all they had. As they stepped back into the streets, heading toward the outskirts of the town, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Steele. Had he made it out of the cabin alive? Was he still fighting? The question gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for distractions. They had to survive. But even as she told herself that, a nagging feeling settled deep in her chest. The world felt like it was closing in on them, and no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't outrun the danger. "Ben," she said, breaking the silence, "I need to know. Are you in this with me? Because I can't do this alone." Ben looked at her for a long moment, his face tired but resolute. Finally, he nodded. "I'm with you. Let's finish this." And with that, they took their first step toward whatever was coming next, into the unknown, where survival was the only option and redemption was a far-off dream. The fight is far from over for Sarah and Ben, but they found a temporary ally in Sam. Will this new safe house provide the protection they need, or is it just another trap? And what about Steele? Has he truly sacrificed himself, or will he return to help them? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below.